All right, welcome everyone. Today is the second day of our 7-part lecture series called Deconstructing Racism, organized by GCC's Social Sciences Division, the Associated Students of Glendale Community College, ASGCC, and Student Equity. Thank you so much for tuning into tonight to learn more as a community in hopes that education will drive us to action. So before we begin, a few announcements. First of all, we have interpretation and closed captioning services available tonight for our deaf or hard of hearing audiences. If you have the option of pinning the interpreters by clicking on the 3 dots on the box where their faces can be found. And the second note is you can also follow along using closed captioning. A transcript will be saved after the event. So allow me to introduce myself. My name is Noah Zarain Samadian. I am a Senator of Activities in the Associated Students of Glendale Community College. I would like to welcome our presenters for today, Beth Kronbeck, Instructor of Ethnic Studies, History, and Social Sciences, and Social Science Department Chair, Kevin Mack, Instructor of History, and Maite Peterson, Instructor of History. We will be having a 1.5-hour lecture on the construction of American racism, followed by a 30-minute Q&A. For GCC students only, we will also be having a healing circle open immediately after this event, led by Student Equity Counselor Alexandra Evans, to provide students with a safe space to discuss and process the heavy topics that will be covered tonight. A separate link to this healing circle will be sent in the chat.
Okay, so are you done, Noah?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. My name is Beth Kronbeck. Thank you for having me. As Noah said, I'm a professor of history, ethnic studies, and social science. And I just want to thank all of you out there who have given up your Friday night to come and listen to our talk. Thank you for being here.
Hi, everyone. My name is Maite Peterson. I want to thank ASGCC. I want to thank Student Equity, and I want to thank Mike Dulai, who's the Division Chair for Social Sciences, for putting together this really important event.
Hi, and I'm Beth and Maite's colleague. My name is Kevin Mack. And I guess a way to start this thing is to ask, what do we hope to do for the next 90 minutes?
Uh-oh. Give me a second.
So the way to think about this is we have 3 questions for today. One, how was race created? Now, last night we heard Professor July define race as a social construction that leads to systematic inequality based on real or perceived physical differences, described externally and used to reproduce power. So what we want to look at is this concept of race, how it was used to reproduce power. What we are going to be demonstrating is that the history of this country has been a history of whites being over blacks. It has been a history of white supremacy. What we want to look at is how this was created, 1. 2, how is this concept of race perpetuated over time? We're going to be looking at a ton of stuff. We're going to be looking at revolution or revolts in the 1600s. We're going to be looking at welfare policies in the 20th century. Don't lose the forest for the trees. It's what we want to keep returning to is this notion of race. History never exactly repeats itself. Mark Twain is popularly credited with saying history rhymes, that it doesn't actually repeat, but it rhymes. And we're going to look at how the concept of race is filtered over all of these years and how, you can kind of draw a line between George Floyd's death and, these concepts of race that we're going to be discussing, in the 1500s and 1600s. Finally, we're going to look at what were the attempts of Black Americans to contest the restrictions placed on race. And one last point about that is, as we're looking at how white folks believe, what they believe about Black folks, we're also saying a lot about whites. Whiteness is constructed around this other of African Americans. So we're going to be talking as much about white folks as Black folks during this presentation.
And the other thing we wanted to let everybody know is that the 3 of us are going to sort of be switching slides. It's not one speaker doing a third of the presentation and then a second third. We're going to be talking to each other and trying to have a conversation as best that we can. So you might not want to pin just one speaker unless, of course, you're watching the interpreters. So when we got together and we started talking about, you know, how far back do we want to go when we talk about this construct of racism in the United States, we thought, well, we should really go back to where we see it begin in Europe. And where we see it begin in Europe are these travel accounts of the 16th and the 17th century. Historian Jennifer Morgan, she writes in her book, Laboring Women, about how these visitors to Africa reported that they saw pregnant women like squat in the field and give birth with no pain. And then they would take these newborn babies, throw them on their back, and then throw their breast over their shoulders to suckle. And you can see that image here. And you know, we may hear this and we may say, oh my gosh, this is totally ridiculous. Like why should we pay attention to this? Well, they're starting to lay a narrative, and it's an interesting narrative, right? It's a narrative about Africans that if women don't experience labor pain, that means that they're not descendant of Eve, if you're following Christianity, right? And they're also laying another narrative that women are good laborers in the fields.
Right, and as we see a map we're going to look at just in a second, there's a vacuum there. With this vacuum of information about African Americans, all sorts of terrible ideas can take root. You can see on the map, there's like a cyclops where Nigeria and Cameroon is. There's a vacuum there, and into this vacuum stepped white folks to define, or steps white philosophers to define what Black folks actually are like, allegedly. Some of these are Enlightenment philosophers. Now, two we'll focus on is David Hume, arguably the most important English language philosopher, and Immanuel Kant. Both of these figures are seminal figures in the European Enlightenment. That was an intellectual movement that shifts over to the United States, and it really surrounds the sort of debates of the Constitutional Convention. So this movement really frames how this country was first created. Now, about Hume, he's a Scottish guy, and he contends that where one is born, i.e. geography, determines one's characteristics. And because he's a European guy, he says that if you live in Europe, you are superior, and if you live in the tropics, you are inferior. Now, these characteristics, because they're innate, they're unchanging. You could take an African out of Africa and transplant him or her in London, and they will still be inferior according to this idea. Now, what are these qualities alleged to Africans by this white guy? That they are indolent. They're defined by indolence, which is laziness. And they're also promiscuous, that they love bodily pleasures. They love carnal pleasures. This sounds ridiculous, but let's put a pin in these ideas because they are going to be filtered through the centuries we're going to talk about. Africans also are incapable of superior intellectual thought and achievements. Now, Hume used as evidence a reading of history that said Africans had never achieved any great civilizing achievements. Of course, he hadn't really studied Ghana, Mali, hadn't studied really Egypt. He hadn't really studied these people, but I guess part of white privilege is being able to talk about things you really don't know much about. Maybe I'm doing that right now. We'll let you see. Now, Kant builds upon this sort of foundation of Hume. He's writing in the early 1700s, and Kant builds upon this in this really influential essay on aesthetics, like our understanding of art. And he's concerned or interested in what is beautiful, what makes one happy, and what is art that is the sublime, what inspires awe. Now, according to Kant, only superior peoples, races, are capable of doing that. Africans are only capable of coarse pleasures, only those things that the basest of the base can achieve. Now, he argues that, some even lower class whites had achieved great art, but, no Africans had ever achieved great art. Again, I don't know, that's Kant's ignorance, and he's surrounding it with racism. Now, why do we talk about these guys? Because they have a profound influence on Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States, the author of the Declaration of Independence, and usually called one of the foremost intellectuals of his time. Now, what Jefferson believes, building upon this Enlightenment foundation, that Negroes act, according to Jefferson, in a book published in 1784 called Notes on the State of Virginia, that Negroes act more out of sensation than reflection. They're not really thinking logically, according to Jefferson. That Africans are quite inferior in reason and powers of imagination. And that for these distinctions, Jefferson believed that nature had created these racial qualities, not their condition. Now, this is powerful because even according to Jefferson, even if you free slaves, they never can be equal to whites.
Right. But before we get to Jefferson, we actually have to start in the colonies.
It's true.
I am trying to get to the next slide. Wow, hold on, give me just a second. Okay, Maite.
All right, so before we're getting into Jefferson, right, we have to start with the colonies, because even though, so like when you're looking at the travel accounts, you have to then understand, as Kevin said, like you got to put these little pins into these like running themes, right? You have to understand that in 1619, in the colonies, like we don't have a real understanding of Africa. We don't have a real understanding of African culture. We don't have an understanding of African society, right? Therefore, when we have the first arrival of 20 enslaved Africans on the colonies, you have to know that the foundations that are here are lack of knowledge, lack of wanting to get any knowledge about these cultures. And then what'll happen is the institution of slavery that's developed here in the colonies that will develop into the United States. That's really important because something different happens here that hadn't happened really in other places in the world. Like you have to understand that by 1619, there was already slavery existed throughout the world in different societies, right? Different civilizations. By 1619, you have other nations bringing African people into the Caribbean and other places with the slave trade. So the question here to think about is like what happens in the colonies that will develop into the United States that creates this institution of slavery that will get us into eventually a civil war, right? So let's talk a little bit about that. So it's going to be in 1619 when a Dutch ship brings 20 enslaved Africans into the colony. They're looked at as another source of labor, right? Before using African slaves in the colonies, what was used as cheap labor were indentured servants. Something important to understand about that is that indentured servants, it wasn't based on race. This was a class thing, right? So you have white English people, and this is the way they had done it in England as well, using the servitude of usually poor white young men and young women usually, right? The thing with indentured servitude is that you're contracting yourself to pay off a debt. So you're gonna work, but then you can be freed, right? So when we have the arrival of these first Africans here, you're gonna kind of have some resemblance of that at first, right? All labor again is
just a question. So there's no basis of race on this, right?
There's no basis.
Like black, white, you're working.
You're working and you're treated based on your class. So it's not like, white indentured servants were treated much better, right? So you have that. So initially, it's not divided by race, right? And the other thing, like what ends up happening too is between 1620, 1660, you have a tobacco boom in the Chesapeake area. So this is why now the English colonists are going to be looking for a more abundant source of cheap labor, right? And this is why then they become involved in, again, the slave trade that had already existed, right? So going here, so just as Kevin noted, it wasn't based on race. So what we have here is that in early America, those early enslaved Black people could earn their freedom. It almost in the same way that indentured servants could earn their freedom. So they could purchase back their freedom from the master, and then they could even own property. They can establish independent lives. We have this case here, a really great example of this happening, Anthony and Mary Johnston, and this is a story of two enslaved people. He first, is able to buy off his freedom. He's able to purchase property. She, I think, is being the only Black woman. They get married and they establish a life, right? And so again, think about that. It could have gone a little bit differently, right? So they buy a tobacco farm, and they get to the point where they have servants themselves. Right? They have servants themselves. By 1650, everything they had done, they won 2 different court cases. This also goes to show that having freedom, having economic independence, being able to own property will also grant you some power, right? So to the point that they actually won 2 court cases. The other thing is they're able now to convert to Christianity. And why am I bringing that up? It's because the idea had been that you don't enslave Christians cannot enslave other Christians, right? You should not enslave Christians. This is one of the reasons why it was sort of justified that you can go into Africa, kidnap people, bring them here and force them into labor, is because they're not Christian. Not only is with going back to what Beth was saying, as far as like, they're not really human, they're not descendants of Eve. You're dehumanizing them, and again, they're not Christians. So you start to see these justifications of why they could be treated a little bit differently. Right?
However, if you can convert, if you can't enslave your fellow Christian, what happens if that slave converts?
Let's find out what happens. So again, the colonists here are going to try to find justification. So, and it really does have to do with money too, like the economy, right? Like again, you have this tobacco boom. You want to have a lot of enslaved people. You want to profit as much as you can out of this fertile land, right? So what'll happen is that we're going to have a period where we the House of Burgesses will put into place a series of laws that will slowly be stripping these, anyone of African descent really, stripping their rights, stripping their protections. And not only that, but some of these laws will also then really protect white, wealthy, white property owning men. So let me give you two, I'll read these two and then I'll sort of like talk about a few others. So whereas some doubts have arisen whether children got by any Englishman upon a Negro woman should be slave or free, be it therefore enacted and declared by this present Grand Assembly that all children born in this country shall be held bond or free, only according to the condition of the mother. So what this law is saying now is that if there is question of, the status of a person, right, they're going to solidify that from moving forward, from this point forward, anyone born here will be either free or enslaved based on the condition of the mother, right? And think about that, because that's not really how it had been. It's always usually like you take your father's last name, it's a patriarchy, but here we're turning it into that it's based on the condition of the mother. For one, you can see who the mother is, right? You can see who's giving birth to this person. It really means that for Black women who are enslaved, their children from this point forward will be enslaved. White women and their children will be protected. The other thing that I want you to notice here is that it makes the status of slavery, it will make paternity irrelevant, right? This is very important because one of the things that's happening at this time, sadly, and will continue to happen, is the rape of Black women. So what you have is now, again, white men who are making these laws, who are protecting their interests, and again, stripping the rights and the protection of anyone of African origin, right? Because you have to then start thinking about the generations who are coming forward. The next law here, whereas some doubts have risen whether children, so going to Kevin's question, here we go, what happens now, right? Can someone convert to Christianity? Whereas some doubts have arisen whether children that are slaves by birth and by the charity and piety of their owners made partakers of the blessed sacrament of baptism should by virtue of their baptism be made free, it is enacted and declared by this present assembly and the authority thereof that the conferring of baptism does not alter the condition of the person as to his bondage or freedom. So now it doesn't matter. You can now, from this point forward, if somebody converts to Christianity, they are still enslaved. It doesn't alter the condition. I want to also just point out, when Kevin also said that we're going to be talking about race and we're going to be talking about what it means to be Black in America, but also whiteness, because look at the language that they choose to do here, by the charity and the piety of their owners. Right? So we're already establishing that these white people who are holding people enslaved, they're good people. That's the message here. That's the message, right?
Yeah, and what's fascinating is we see, one, slavery is now becoming a permanent condition, which has never existed legally. And as you said before, Maite, they're almost doing a 180 in terms of how property is inherited, how stuff gets passed down. They're going from the patriarchy to the matriarchy. That ain't progressive, of course. It is to protect white males who are raping their slave women.
Right. And I find it interesting. Oh, I'm sorry, Kevin. I find it interesting too that they, both of these laws, what they do is they erase the guilt.
Yeah.
Right. You can have your own children as slaves. You can own other Christians as slaves, and you don't need to feel guilty about it because the House of Burgesses, the government in Virginia, the first colony, is saying it's okay.
I got your back, no doubt.
It's okay. So just to hit the 3 points. Now with these laws, and you can go to the next slide too, Beth. With these laws, slavery is now inheritable. It's a life term. You can't buy your way out of it. You can't work your way out of it. And now it's based on race. Okay. And so now it's based on race. And again, think about that. First, we have those accounts, what Kevin was talking about, Beth it's talking about these ideas, and moving forward with these laws, we're really going to put these things into into concrete, these concrete ideas. Here's just another series. I'm not going to go into every one of these laws. But now here's, again, stripping them of their rights. The first one here, 1639, we want to disarm Black men, right? So all colonists will have, be provided arms and ammunition except Africans, right? Sorry, I have the notes here. Illegal to help. So then the other thing is that it begins to separate Black and white, right? So not only is this institution now going to be based on race, but we're starting to see that the wealthy class, the planter class, the owning class, is going to want to start to create a little bit of a divide, because we'll see in other ways how then it gets divided even further, but create a little bit of a divide on race. So Virginia, so freed Blacks may not use white labor, right? So again, in the case of Anthony and Mary, where they were able to do that, you cannot do that anymore. If a white man marries a Negro or mulatto, this is in quotes, Negro, mulatto, or Indian, they are banished from the colony. So this is starting to create these miscegenation laws, as they were called, right, where you cannot intermarry. And this goes on and on, not until 1967, the case of Loving v. Virginia, are we going to then start to rectify that.
And look how deliberate this is. Like, they're just like this piece after piece creating this other. And really, we hit on two fears. Maite, at 1639, Blacks can't own guns, and in 1691, Blacks can't sleep with white people. I mean, they're hitting at two of the big sources of white insecurity.
Well, you can't get married.
Yeah. Yeah.
Here, some court cases, right? To also, again, in the same ideas. So here's one of the court cases that what happens in these circumstances. White indentured servant sleeping with a Black mid-servant. He is whipped for defiling his body and lying with a Negro, right? So again, this is what's happening. This crime here, 4 white indentured servants, 1 Black servant, conspiracy to escape. The punishment, white servants receive extra service, while the Black servant is whipped, branded, and wore shackles for a year. So now what you're seeing here is, again, this is what I'm talking about, that separation, that divide, right? So if you're a white indentured servant, maybe you don't want to try to be helping and putting your neck on the line for a Black person, right? And look at the white person, their punishment is not as severe as the Black person, right? 1669, the crime is a Black man disobeys his master, punishment, toes cut off. This is important to start to understand the violence that is exercised upon Black bodies from early on, right? This is, again, going back to the reason why we're having this lecture series, this idea of violence against Black men, Black women, Black bodies. Violence has been coming upon them for generations and generations. 1707, the crime, white master kills his slave, punishment, none. Conversely, white men will be able to exercise violence, will be able to do these kind of things with impunity, right? So what we're going through now, again, is not new. We have deep roots in this history.
Yeah, and so as we're constructing these laws and these court cases are being passed, what we see happen in the historical record is there's going to be this shift, a shift in the type of labor that we use, right? We have preferred white labor, white indentured servants, because they're cheap and they're coming from England and we know them, and they're expendable and it's easier. But what's going to happen by the time we get to the 1670s, the 1680s, and again, you saw those laws, we put them in order of progression. Life expectancy increases in the colonies. So that means people are living longer. Something else happens. The Royal Africa Company loses their monopoly on the slave trade. More companies get involved in the trading of slaves. So what's going to happen to the price of slaves? It's going to drop. It's going to be easier to purchase slaves. Economics improve in England. So not so many of those poor white indentured servants actually want to come to the New World anymore. And then we see that owning slaves starts to get this prestigious feel, like you, look at you, you have, it's this ownership, right? After all those laws are passed, this ownership of look at how many I own, look at how good
Market
I am. Say it again, Kevin.
It's a market prestige, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
And that's really important to note, because that's what, like, by the time that we get to the Civil War, right, like, this is really people in the South, especially like the planter class, those who own slaves, it's like you are attacking their identity. You're attacking part of like who they are, right?
Mm-hmm. And then there was one more thing that really sort of solidified the labor shift
Right.
from using white indentured servants to slaves, and that was
Bacon's Rebellion in 1676. This arguably is the most important event in American colonial history. So it's a giant rebellion in Jamestown colony around the Chesapeake Bay, and it scares the hell out of the powers that be in Virginia. So let's talk about first why this happened, and then we'll talk about why this is such a momentous event in colonial history. Beth and Maite laid it out, legal framework and sort of the social framework here. Virginia's growing. As this is happening, elites of Virginia are monopolizing land. They're enjoying all the advantages that comes to them by owning tons of slaves and employing lots of indentured servants. Now, meanwhile, as indentured servants are being freed, typically, as Maite said, you work for about 7 to 9 years, you get free, typically you get some land at the end of it. Well, the problem is that all the land, the fertile land is being taken up, and it's being taken over by these elite families. So servants are struggling to realize that life that they had envisioned themselves when they came over to the Americas. Now, as these indentured servants can't find land, typically where Jamestown is, they go inland where they bump into American Indians who, you might imagine, don't take too kindly to all these white folks stamping through their land and saying, now it's ours. Now, eventually what happens? These tensions are on the frontier, kind of the spark. And this massive coalition comes together, made up of indentured servants and also, interestingly, Black slaves. You have this cross-racial coalition come together and try to tear down the power structure. It's led by Nathaniel Bacon, hence why it's called Bacon's Rebellion. And it's incredibly successful at first. They actually torch Jamestown to the ground. Now, eventually, Bacon dies of dysentery. It's pretty nasty. They execute some of the ringleaders, and this rebellion fizzles out. But why is it so significant? One, white elites recognize after this, they can't allow something like this to happen again. So they begin making alliances with the middle and lower classes of Jamestown. For instance, maybe middle classes can be like a tax collector. Two, white elites realize we have to change the demography of Virginia. We can't have all of these white frustrated indentured servants who might demand land at the end of their service. Better, why not we import more of these African slaves who were already doing a pretty darn good job of dehumanizing them and creating them in the other. That'll create a body of labor that's easier to control. Now, to cinch this change, the elites had to start encouraging a racial consciousness. They had to make sure that poor whites would never look to Black slaves as a possible ally against the elites. They had to sort of teach or encourage poor whites to enjoy feeling superior to Black slaves. W.B. Du Bois, who I believe Dr. Although I think he'd like to be called Dr. Kamei. Professor Kamei talked about yesterday, a major sociology. He talks about the wages of whiteness, that a poor white gets like something good from feeling, you know, it might be poor, but at least I'm better than Blacks. And this idea is perpetuated over the years.
And I want to just come back real quick and talk about the House of Burgesses, because Jamestown is in Virginia, and House of Burgesses is the government in Virginia. And if you don't think that Virginia was an important colony, I want you to think about how many presidents came from Virginia. We have Washington, we have Jefferson, we have Madison, we have Monroe. 4 out of the first 5 presidents come from Virginia. So please recognize that Virginia, the House of Burgesses, is laying out what is eventually going to become our American values. So just keep that in the back of your mind.
So in the wake of Bacon's Rebellion, we see this massive shift to slavery. In Virginia colony, you see 1650, there's 300 slaves. 100 years later, it's 150,000. once the colonies shift now into the United States, it becomes a national concern. We see a lot of slaves in the South, but we also see significant numbers of slaves up north. And New York City in particular had a lot of slaves. And continuing past 1790s, you see on that table on the right, from less than 700,000 to on the eve of the Civil War, there's almost 4 million slaves living in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as all these Black folks are being imported into the country, and later on they're filling these plantations, whites felt this almost the psychological need to create an other there. And part of it was through pseudoscience, through scientific racism. The notion that, it's not enough just to believe that Africans are not capable of sort of intellectual achievement like whites, but they're actually distinct. They're almost like a different species. We see this in this image from 1799, where they're comparing skulls in the bottom right. Beth, could you go to the next slide?
Yeah, and think about that first image, right, of those travel accounts that women don't have labor pain.
And this becomes quite explicit in pseudoscience continues for over 50 years to 1854, where the superior race is a skull that looks like Apollo Belvedere, because all white people look like a Greek statue. But if you see in the middle, the skull of alleged to belong to an African American, it's closer to a chimpanzee. And the scientists, the quote unquote scientists at this time would measure craniums, and they'd say, yeah, this is definitely it. You can prove it through science that Africans are distinct from whites.
And then as we create them as the other, that gives us permission to do this kind of thing.
Right, and oftentimes disciplining Blacks, it wasn't enough, because this really serves no practical purpose. But what it does is it humiliates them.
I want to add that, like, with this kind of thing of humiliating and like this type of violence and this type of humiliation on the body, it functions to, again, keep control over the person who it's being done to, but also any other enslaved people who are seeing this, right? So if somebody gets punished and they're put into a specific type of shackle, or if they're beaten a certain way, they will also then in turn understand that, like, okay, then I need to be careful in what I say, how I act, what I do, right?
And I think it's important to think about also, and I hadn't thought about this before until just now, no white indentured servant would ever have to wear this. Mm. So again, it's part of that divide, right? That divide of the poor whites against this Black labor. All right, so how could people do this? We saw the rise of the numbers. How do people support this condition of slavery? So when we look at the historical record, what we see is that there's 3 pillars that the South used to support the ideology of slavery and slavery being good. And the first pillar that they looked to was the Bible. They said that the Bible approved of slavery because the Bible has scriptures of masters and servants needed to obey their masters. And I'm sure that there's some of you out there who have read the autobiography of Frederick Douglass, and you might recall that he said the cruelest masters of all were the ones who were very religious, right? They felt that God was giving them permission to be as cruel as they needed to be. The second pillar we've already touched on with the scientific notions that Africans are simply inferior. They're unsuited for life in any other type of condition. The only life they're suited for is for servitude to clearly the superior whites. And then the final pillar was they argued that slavery supported freedom. What? All right, so they argued that Greeks and Romans had slaves, and look at what they were able to create. And then they looked at the poor whites that are living in the South, and they said, yes, slavery grants you freedom, because if we didn't have this Black labor to do all of this horrible work, you would have to do this work. Right? And this is important when we think about the Civil War, right? Why did poor whites fight to support this institution when poor whites didn't own slaves? Well, they didn't want to be those slaves. Mm-hmm. All right, so what does life look like for slaves that are in the South? I want to just briefly talk about the 3/5 compromise, because I think it's often misunderstood. I've heard people say the Constitution said that African Americans were only worth 3/5 of a person. And I say, no, it was worse than that. If they were saying you were worth 3/5 of a person, that meant you would have 3/5 worth of human rights. They had no rights. The 3/5 meant that the white Southerners who owned them could count them towards population so they could get more representation in Congress. So it was even worse than how bad people think it is. If you were to leave a plantation, you had to always have ID on you. You had absolutely no autonomy. You were always worried that you would wake up one day and your spouse would be gone or your children would be gone because the master was in need. They didn't have credit cards back then. The master needs cash. He's going to sell a slave or two. It was illegal to become educated. It was illegal to have your own religious services unless a white person was there to monitor what you were doing. And then also think about the difference in lives between men who are slaves and women who are slaves. Women who are slaves always ran the risk of having, to be sexually assaulted, to be raped, typically by the master of the house. And he did this for two reasons. He did it, one, because he could. And then he also did it because if she became pregnant, he increased her wealth. And I think it's important to note that at the time the Civil War breaks out, a good field hand was worth, in today's money, about $40,000. So a female slave giving you another slave, that increases your wealth quite a bit.
One thing we're talking about, sorry, Beth, just what Beth was talking about there is it's creating this notion that Blacks need to be watched, that they need to be surveyed.
Mm-hmm.
If one's to leave the plantation, they always have to have papers, that they always need to be watched. Just remember this as we.
Yeah, the controlling of bodies again.
Right.
All right, so was life much better for free Blacks in the North? What we see after the Declaration of Independence is state after state will slowly start granting manumission. Some places like New York, it took like 20, 25 years for it to happen. But we do have free Blacks in the North. Their lives were not easy. Their businesses were boycotted. Educational opportunities were restricted. Again, sort of this controlling. Like, you can be successful, but you can't be too successful. You can be educated, but you can't be too educated. And it's important to note that in the North, when people were anti-slavery, for the most part, they were anti-slavery because they didn't want unfair competition. If you owned a small farm in upstate New York, you didn't want somebody moving in next door that would have 100 slaves because you couldn't compete against them. So often the anti-slavery movement was economic. And then, of course, in 1851, I'm sure you guys have seen movies about this. After the Fugitive Slave Act, when California becomes a state, no free Black is safe. They had to go out in pairs because slave catchers were coming north and capturing people and forcing them back into servitude. And then before I move on to the next image, we wanted to put this picture here. This is Mr. Robert Morris. He was the first African-American to win a case in the United States Court of Law. Take a good look at how he's dressed and how he's carrying himself, because we're going to show you how the North depicted free Blacks.
So we've been discussing this notion of whiteness, that a whiteness needs to be constructed to feel better about oneself, and to sort of separate the folks. Edward Clay commissioned a bunch of images called Life in Philadelphia during the 1820s. And while this is going to say nothing at all about what African Americans are like, it's going to say a hell of a lot about what whites are afraid of. So the text is difficult to read, so we type that out to the left. We see a slave to the left named Caesar, and we see a woman in a yellow dress named Miss Chloe. Now, Caesar asked Miss Chloe, "How do you find yourself in this hot weather, Miss Chloe? It's very, very hot." Obviously, they are poking fun at African Americans and suggesting they're stupid, they can't speak English correctly.
Their dialect, yeah.
Yeah, their dialect. So Miss Chloe answers, "Pretty well, I thank you, Mr. Caesar. Only I aspire too much." Now, focus on that word aspire. On one hand, obviously, she meant perspire. You sweat when it's hot. But it's very deliberately the word is chosen aspire, because in the eyes of Edward Clay and other white supremacists, her real sin is trying to aspire to whiteness, trying to rise up to whiteness.
Mm-hmm.
Also,
and
can I just say
yeah,
also
ahead,
like with the image, like the woman's dress and the woman's hat, it's not necessary, it's like exaggerated, right? It's not like really placed on correctly. It's showing again that even when they try, like they're not getting it right. They're going back to those early ideas that we're talking about, that like they just are different, right?
Mm-hmm.
Actually the most popular form of entertainment of the 19th century is minstrelsy. Now this is sort of a form of like vaudeville theater where white entertainers would darken their face and behave in ways that are typically attributed to be stereotypical, and putting them in scare quotes, stereotypical African-American behavior. One famous sort of personage was Jim Crow, as you can see in the left. In the middle, there's Zip Coon, again, poking fun at African Americans, using that through humiliation to put them down, to reassert the superiority of whites. Now, on the right, it's an advertisement for actually a blackface group. And what's important about the Virginia Serenaders is that before they'd perform, they would come out all in white. They'd have no sort of decoration costume on at all, because they wanted to assure the audience, don't worry. Like, you're watching white people. We got this. What we're going to do is we're going to go back and we're going to be making fun of these blacks, but you ain't going to see blacks. Don't worry, we're making fun of them. And it's all to relieve this sense of fear that whites might think blacks are trying to rise up and to achieve equality. And this last image here by our old friend Edward W. Clay, called The Fruits of Amalgamation. Now, Maite had talked earlier about laws that made it illegal for a white and a black to get married. We can see that fear continuing on into the 19th century. This is a black man sitting on the couch in the center of that image, married to a white woman to the left. And this is the great fear of white supremacists. You have a black man marrying a white woman, and everything is off in this scene. You have a dog in the foreground to the right reading a book. That's crazy. But what's even more infuriating to the white audience this was made for is seeing the white man being a servant to the right. That is not supposed to happen in the America that was made in the wake of the Declaration of Independence.
Something else to point out is that when, African Americans were trying to make, anytime that they were trying to make progress, even later on in the periods, that was again one of the fears for white men, right? Is that the only reason they want progress, or the only thing that's going to come of this, is that black men want to marry white women, right? Where that is not the case, was not the case. And again, when you're talking about like interracial, usually with the violence, which we'll talk a little bit about later, that it was usually the other way around, right?
Remember, Hume said blacks are promiscuous. This is what they've been saying for over 100 years. Right.
It goes back to those philosophers. So these ideas had never really gone away. And this, I appreciated that Kevin added this one to our presentation, because this goes back to what I was talking about. You could be in the North, and anti-slavery meant that, it was an economic argument, but you could also be pro-union. If you notice at the bottom, it says the Union forever. So these are people, they're not in the Confederacy, Union forever, and an outrage, an abolitionist was someone who wanted to end slavery of the most revolting character is among you, exciting the feelings of the North against the South. So they're going to have a lecture about it in the House of God to talk about how horrible this abolitionist is.
The real American stands for slavery. A real American is for the Union, according to this.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this image also comes from us about 1850. And another argument that's going to be used for slave owners is that, it's actually ethical, especially as the Industrial Revolution is beginning in the North. And whites are being paid very low wages by factory owners. White slave owners down south had the gall to compare themselves favorably to those factory owners up north, to say, look, you don't pay your wages, you're paying your workers a lot of wages, but we actually care for our slaves. We feed them, we clothe them, as we see in this image here. We see an older African-American couple to the left, and we see their owner to the right. Now on the left, we reproduce the text. The slave is saying, God bless you, master. You feed and clothe us. When we are sick, you nurse us. And when too old to work, you provide for us. That's wonderful. And on the right, the master is saying, you know, these poor creatures, this is like my white slave owner voice, I guess. These poor creatures are a sacred legacy from my ancestors. And while a dollar is left me, nothing shall be spared to increase their comfort and happiness.
Yeah, these ideas were really common at the time. After 1850, when photography becomes very popular, you're going to see images of photographs, family portraits, and things like that, where they include the enslaved people next to them or with the children. And again, showing like, look at the, you know, that how we treat them. We're so benevolent. We're so good, right?
And if you define African Americans as incapable of living in free society, well, then according to that definition, they are really doing a service. Because
right, that
African Americans
taking care of them. Right?
Yeah.
And just be aware that this narrative still continues today. I can't even count how many times I've heard politicians sort of make a side comment that, well, the slaves didn't have it so bad. Everything was taken care of for them, right? And I don't know if I should bring up Trevor Noah on The Daily Show. He said, yeah, if slavery wasn't so bad, how come no white people volunteered to be a slave?
So now, oftentimes too, racism and slavery is confined to the South. And what we want to emphasize and why this problem of racism is still so entrenched in American culture and institutions is it was not a Southern thing. What is called racial capitalism, sort of the intertwining of racism in the capitalist system, is a national thing. Northerners who perhaps never even seen a black person were addicted to goods produced by slaves. They liked putting sugar in their tea. They liked smoking tobacco after dinner. The Industrial Revolution, which powered the North's economic growth, that ate up textiles. And those textiles were produced by slaves, be they cotton, be they indigo. And the entire infrastructure grew up where you have ships taking raw cotton to Europe. You have a pretty vigorous, within the United States, slave trading industry. Most sort of economic activity, one way or another, is connected to slavery. And Americans knew this. Americans knew that they had blood on their hands. As the country is going to be expanding westward, slavery, or rather racism, is going to continue with that, even in places that are off limits to slavery. We'll take as a case study the territory of Oregon. Now, the Oregon Territory becomes a territory in the 1840s because of its northern location, something called the Missouri Compromise that was passed in 1820. It drew a line down the middle of the United States, and it said territories to the north have to be can't be slave territories, and to the south, they must be slave territories. So the Oregon Territory, by dint of it being in the north, banned slavery. But when it petitions to become a territory, it also votes to require all African Americans to leave. So when it actually becomes a state, when it wants to become a state, voters reject slavery. They say, you know, we don't want slavery here. And you might think, oh, awesome, Oregon, Portland, goofy music and good coffee, cool. But at that same convention, 89% of voters voted to exclude people of color. Now that wasn't just, we don't want them coming in, but actually expelling African Americans of Oregon at that time. Now, when federal law said, you can't really do that, the state constitution did vote to prevent any Black Americans from owning property or voting in Oregon. When Oregon is finally forced to stand down in 1862 and allow these things, it does levy a $5 tax on any non-whites who persisted in living there. And this tax would persist for decades. The point of bringing this up is that these racist ideas don't even have to be connected to slavery, don't have to be connected to the South. It is truly corrupting our entire country. We see this really in 1857 in one of the most notorious Supreme Court cases in American history. It's Dred Scott. And briefly, this is on the eve of the Civil War. Dred Scott had been a slave. He was taken to the north, to the Wisconsin Territory, which was declared off limits to slavery. His master dies, and Dred Scott petitions the Supreme Court and says, I should be freed for that. Now, why is this so significant? Because the Supreme Court really is putting an official print on so much of what Maite and Beth have been talking about. Now, the Chief Justice, Roger Taney, among other things, a racist slave owner, he declares that Scott, as a Black person, as a slave, doesn't even have standing to press a case in a court of law. So, the case is thrown out. But he goes further. He argues, as we write here, that people of African descent lack a history of freedom. Therefore, they don't even fit into our framework of government and cannot be citizens. So on the eve of the Civil War, all African Americans, even ones that aren't slave, are declared not citizens by the Supreme Court of the United States.
And it's ironic, right? Because who took their freedom? And just real quick, for everyone who is listening, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. They are being taken down. So I know we're covering lots of, we're going really fast, and we're covering lots of territory here. But if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll get to as many as we can.
Okay, so Cornerstone of the Confederacy, by the time that we do get to, you know, the point of the Civil War, I want to point out here that Alexander Stephens, who becomes the vice president of the Confederacy, he gives a speech, and it really lays out what the Confederate government is going to be about, right? His speech ends up being called the Cornerstone of the Confederacy. Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea of the Constitution.
Uh-oh, I think Maite got frozen.
I think we can keep reading then until she comes back.
Yeah, that its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests, the foundation of the Confederacy, upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. And we wanted to put this in here in particular because of what's happening right now, modern day, with the Confederate statues that are coming down. And it was interesting because my daughter showed me a meme that's going around Facebook that said, you're worried about knocking down these historical monuments. The Confederacy was only around for 5 years. Like, how much of a history is that 5 years of time?
Right. I mean, and so what we demonstrate is the Civil War is primarily about race. This notion about states' rights and everything, that's a red herring. They wanted states' rights so they could maintain slavery. And when we see discussions about we need the Confederate flag as heritage, it's actually just a symbol of this white supremacy. It's also a symbol of a group of people who wanted to end the United States. They're in fact actually the greatest traitors this country has ever had. Now the Civil War is fought. Spoiler alert, the Union wins. And in the wake of the Civil War, 3 amendments are passed, which are supposed to, at least legally end slavery and racism, although as we'll talk about, they don't quite live happily ever after. The 13th Amendment officially ends slavery. The 14th Amendment grants citizenship and constitutional protections to to all persons, including freed slaves. And the 15th Amendment is supposed to give all voting privileges to all citizens as long as they're male.
Men. So we didn't live happily ever after, Kevin? This didn't fix everything?
No, right. All right. So we see the period of Reconstruction, and there is for a brief moment, there is an idea that African Americans might have a chance at creating a life of independence and autonomy. It's an idea usually attributed to 40 acres and a mule. General William T. Sherman, who among other things burned much of the South to the ground, afterwards discusses with a lot of African Americans, like, look, if you're actually going to enjoy freedom, if you're actually going to enjoy equality, it's not enough just to be free. You have to have the ability to support yourself. So all slaves are given 40 acres and a mule. It's not always exactly 40 acres and a mule, but that's the idea. But that's removed by President Johnson, right, Beth?
Right, because what happens is well, can we back up just for a quick second? Sherman is the only person that actually asked the Black community, how do you guys perceive freedom, right? And their answer is, we want to own our own labor. And so Sherman's like, great, I'm going to give you all this land over here at the Sea Islands, and we'll give you some broken down mules that the Union Army no longer needs. And then at the end of Johnson's presidency, his last act is to pardon all of the men, the generals and all the landowners who fought in the Confederacy. And so they all got their land back. So these individuals who had worked this land and had thought that they had owned it, they had to leave. And basically, right, the Black Americans have nothing at the end of the Civil War.
And what happens is, once they're actually freed, what is steadily going to happen is Southern whites are going to steadily create in law almost all the conditions that had reigned before the 13th Amendment and the Emancipation Proclamation. The Black Codes are passed by a number of southern states. A number of states pass these things called vagrancy laws. A vagrancy law made it illegal not to have a job. Now let's think about how this would work in practice. You're a freed slave, you're looking for a job, you were kept uneducated, you don't have many job skills, your resume is not very long, you've probably never left the plantation. So you're really the only potential employer is probably your former owner. That former owner is probably not going to pay you much. And I think if you're a freed slave, you probably don't want to work for that owner. Now, if you are found guilty of vagrancy, you are fined a pretty steep fine. African Americans, when they're free, don't exactly have a lot of money. So because they have this fine hanging over their heads and they can't pay it, what would happen is the state would auction off their labor to pay it off. So you'd have this situation where across the South, it'd almost be like a slave auction. The difference being now that they're actually auctioning off the labor of a Black man or Black woman.
Right, and this convict lease system, right, begins, that's what Kevin is talking about, right? You go to prison and the state auctions off your labor. So it shouldn't be a surprise that, you know, by the time we're in Reconstruction, 80% of the prison population is now Black men.
Right. And then now over time, you know, what eventually solidifies is something called Jim Crow. And it refers to an entire system of racial segregation across the South. It enforces this racial segregation, includes things like poll taxes, where if you're going to vote, you have to pay a tax. Literacy tests, that you have to pass a test that usually is really, really, really tough to pass. I usually assign it to my history classes and I actually fail. Which I don't think I'm the dumbest guy in the world. It shows how difficult these things are to pass. But the deal was if your grandfather would have been able to vote before the Civil War, you didn't have to take this test. That was called the grandfather clause, and that's what enabled it. Now, just think about one thing just so we don't get too bogged down in the details. It's suggesting that Blacks shouldn't take part in a democracy because they're not capable of this, that they can't reason and have a law. Now, all of this will be sort of approved by the Supreme Court by Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, which, you know, solidifies this idea known as separate but equal. Mm-hmm. Now, not only are these laws and sort of attitudes separating the races, whites also, and one thing we've been hitting on, whites also need to continually reassert their whiteness and their superiority to Blacks. And that's often violence. And I think it's really important in an era when violence and mob activity is overwhelmingly attributed to African Americans. If you look at American history, the vast majority of these cases were done by whites. You can see this really beginning in 1863, the New York City draft riots. It's one of I think, Beth, it's the largest in terms of death.
It's the worst, yeah.
And why it breaks out, a bunch of white working class folks do not like the Civil War. It's happening in New York City in the middle of the Civil War.
They don't want to be drafted.
Don't want to be drafted. They also don't like the fact that the Civil War is a crusade to freed slaves who now will come up, live with them, maybe impregnate their daughters. So they have this huge riot. It lasts a couple days. It's actually only put down by the Union Army. That Union Army had just won at Gettysburg, and they are called back to New York City to suppress this huge revolt that lasts for days. But hundreds of African Americans are killed, dozens lynched. The New York City orphanage for found African Americans is burned to the ground, along with Black businesses and abolitionist homes. You know, during Reconstruction, these same sorts of things happen. This is not an exhaustive list. We're not going to go into the details of each one. Just a few things to pull out major ideas. They're usually caused because of white insecurity and anxiety. In Memphis, which was a city that saw its Black population quadruple in the years right before the Civil War and started seeing a thriving Black middle class, over a couple days, Black mobs slaughtered dozens of African Americans. In New Orleans, a few months later, the state government had, or rather the state governor had made motions about enfranchising all of its Black citizens. Again, this is a few years before the 15th Amendment. This, antagonizes the white residents of Louisiana, and they immediately go around just beating the hell and killing lots of African Americans. The biggest case of racial violence during the Reconstruction era, when we say Reconstruction, it's about the 15 years after the Civil War, was in Colfax, Louisiana. there. That state in the previous year had seen Republicans, who were the party of emancipation, win a lot of gains statewide, and this infuriates whites. A white militia is actually raised, an extra legal white militia. They're able to obtain lots of cannons, and they actually began bombing down on Colfax, which is a predominantly black town. Eventually the town, because they're using the military against them, surrenders. And upon their surrender, the whites massacre estimates over 100 black citizens there. Now, I actually hadn't learned that until grad school. And when we talk about history and things being erased, it's terrifying. Wilmington, also another case that's really terrifying. It was a coup d'etat that happened in broad daylight. Wilmington in 1898 was black majority. It was one of the last places in the South that actually elected a black mayor, a black alderman, and had African Americans in a lot of important positions. Over the months, though, Wilmington whites had grown really angry about black political power in that state. As that newspaper clipping to the right shows, attention white men, there will be a meeting of white men of Wilmington this morning at 11 o'clock. A full attendance is desired as business and the furtherance of white supremacy will be transacted. So that's all pretty language. What actually happens is white mobs descend upon Wilmington. They actually use a Gatling gun against black citizens. Over 100 black Americans die. Essentially, this thriving black community in Wilmington flees. It's a coup d'etat. The mayor is overthrown. Whites are instituted there completely illegally. But the press called it a race riot caused by blacks. The blacks had it coming. Now again, pull back. Why are these sorts of things happening? Because whites are threatened by black social mobility.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And this image also represents a shift in the narrative, right? Black bodies had always sort of been used for labor. It's labor. And then when the Civil War is over and we have the Freedmen's Bureau was the US government organization to really help Black Americans get on their feet. How does the South view this? And if you take a look at this, right, the Black American has gone from being a laborer to now just sort of kicking back, you know, relaxing.
They're relying upon, and as we see, as something that is an attack on African Americans that we'll see later on, the black person is lazy in being supported by the labor of the white man, that his taxes, his labor is supporting this welfare agency for African Americans. And Beth, I'll just push back on one thing you said. You said, this is how Southerners push back. This is the Democratic Party of Pennsylvania.
Oh,
this is how whites thought their tax dollars were going to support Black Americans who aren't deserving. Again, it is, hopefully everybody in this talk tonight finds that completely abhorrent, but when you just look at the entirety of history, we've covered 300 years thus far, that's not out of place.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Hey guys, sorry, I just want to say I'm back. I don't know what happened. I don't know what happened there, so let me catch up.
Back.
Go ahead.
We're done.
Oh, we're done. We finished. Okay. So from this image that we have of a Black man who is, you know, lazy, he's just letting the whites do all the work while he reaps the benefit of the government, we're going to see other images that get produced of free Black men.
Right. And just one quick thing, just remember how Hume said blacks are lazy in the 1700s? The same sort of idea is coming back here. The idea that African Americans are not capable of an actual literary debate, that, you know, they're incapable because of their inferior intellectual ability to actually conduct themselves in democracy. It just evolves into, you know, physical acts against one another, because that's all they're capable of. If you go back to the philosophers, just these crude pleasures.
Mm-hmm. So we wanted to introduce this slide because those are the images that are being produced, but yet this is what real, you know, Black American, Black men who are behaving politically look like. It's amazing to me to think that as soon as the 15th Amendment is passed, the 15th Amendment, reminder, it gave Black men the right to vote, we have immediately 3 Black congressmen from the South. This is 1869. They're from South Carolina, Mississippi, and Georgia. Like, that's amazing, right? That's the 41st Congress. We gain more. By the time we get to the 44th Congress in 1875, there's eight Black congressmen, all from the South, right? Like, wow, things are really going great. Like Black Americans are really going to get their foothold in American democracy. But after 1877, we see it drop. And then we see another drop. So by the time we get to 1891, there's one. By the time we get to 1900, there's 0 Black men in Congress. And believe it or not, we're not going to get another Black man in Congress from the South until 1973. So what the heck happened? And when we look at what happened, when again, we're talking about Black men gaining mobility through government, through politics, there's going to be this huge pushback to put them back in their place. And one of those things, besides the riots that Kevin was talking about, is we can't not talk about the KKK. Formed in 1865 as a way to like stop Reconstruction when the Northerners were coming in and trying to help the former slaves. 1869, the Klan started using violent tactics. And then in 1882, it starts to fade, but then it comes roaring back in 1910. And the reason it comes roaring back in 1910, there's this huge influx of European immigrants coming in. And so how they're going to expand their membership is they're going to say, well, we're not just against the Blacks, we're against everybody. They're against all the European immigrants. They're against Catholics and Jews. They're going to expand their hate list. And by 1925, 4 million members are in the Klan. And Kevin, you think that number is actually higher, right?
I believe it was closer to 6 million. And one thing that Beth is talking about is that this was the biggest social organization of the early 1920s. And it was a respectable social organization.
Yeah,
People
you didn't hide.
Because it offered you all sorts of social connections. And presidents were part of the Ku Klux Klan. Harry Truman was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. And then Beth, you're going to talk about The Birth of a Nation. It was a blockbuster hit.
Yeah, 1915, Birth of a Nation. This film, first feature-length film directed by D.W. Griffith. This was actually screened in the White House for President Wilson. Some of our first social protests of the Black community is asking theaters not to show this film in the early 1900s. And as you can see, the film, it was, the Ku Klux Klan were the heroes. They saved the white woman from the grasps of a Black man who was trying to rape her, and the Klan came in and saved her, and yay. So again, it was, what we're trying to emphasize is the Klan was very mainstream. You didn't hide from it. I think if you take a look at this picture, they're not covering their faces. It's nothing to be ashamed of.
So it's in 1915 that this film comes out, and again, a resurgence of the KKK. But the film, so it's 1915, but it takes place in the era of Reconstruction. But it's really hitting on the fears of people of this era, 1915, right? Everything that they're fearing. Again, this is another way to perpetuate this idea of we have to protect against these dangerous Black men. They're hyper-sexed, they're hyper-violent, and if there's not someone there to protect, then look at what happens. And you see two types of images of Black men here. One is again, the dangerous one who's his only goal in life is to, ravage a young white woman. And then the other ones, some of the images of Black men, it kind of mimics the Darktown, right? Where they're like in Congress, but they just don't know what they're doing. They got their shoes off. They're like got their feet up. And again, that they don't know how to communicate. They don't know how to function appropriately. And it really resonates with people of the time.
So how else are we going to keep Black individuals in their place besides the Klan, Maite? Or Kevin, I'm sorry.
Kevin.
Well, I mean, I take an answer too. But it's the sequel: more riots, more massacres, more insurrections. What we want to pull out is this pattern that during periods where African Americans seem to be rising socioeconomically, politically, there's a oftentimes violent pushback. The resurgence of white nationalism now cannot be separated from the election of Barack Obama to the presidency in 2008. Now, just these white riots right here in 1919, it was a nationwide series of race riots. It hit 38 different cities called Red Summer. Now, in brief, why does this happen? Why is there so much white insecurity? This is in the wake of World War I. Black servicemen had served over in Europe, came home, and quite rationally were demanding equal rights. On top of that, there was something called the Great Migration. African Americans who had often lived in the countryside in the South were moving up north to fill those necessary jobs vacated by soldiers who were fighting over in Europe. Black men and women living in communities that had primarily been white is really upsetting. So as the stats say there, 43 people were lynched that summer, 16 shot, 8 burned at the stake. These riots continue into the next year, they're national. This postcard you see on the right it's a postcard, and it's a postcard of a lynching in Duluth, Minnesota. These postcards were actually really popular in the 1920s. They'd almost be like picnic events where there'd be a family celebrating underneath a body that's hanging on a rope. And the 1920s feature some of the most notorious events of race riots in American history. Both interestingly started because of allegations of Black assault on a white woman. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, a young Black teenager steps on a white woman's foot. She yells out. Rumors begin that he actually had assaulted this white woman. Eventually, a crowd of over 1,000 men surround the courthouse of this wrongfully accused young teenager. And what's important to note, why Tulsa? Tulsa was actually, it had a district that was largely African-American called Black Wall Street. This was a site of thriving Black middle class. So this wasn't a coincidence that it happens in Tulsa. This is just a spark to this powder keg of racial tensions. Eventually, the white mobs go into Tulsa, they go into Black Wall Street, and they raise those symbols of Black mobility to the ground. In Rosewood, Florida, which was just a small self-sufficient town in Florida, just a couple hundred residents, a rumor of a Black assault on a white woman spirals out of control. The KKK eventually gets involved, and this entire town is razed to the ground. Dozens of African Americans flee, and this town is never rebuilt. It actually is completely covered up in history and really only resurfaced in the 1980s because of pioneering scholars who dug in there and said, what the hell happened to this city? This town, rather.
And for those of you who were curious about the Trump administration holding his first rally since the COVID-19 in Tulsa, this is why people are upset.
And it's also on something called Juneteenth, which is a celebration of the emancipation of slaves. So it's really dripping in irony that this president is holding a rally in Tulsa, a site of atrocities against Blacks, on the anniversary of, or on the celebration of African Americans being emancipated.
Absolutely. So the other thing that comes, so we've really, I think, like you, I hope everybody's understanding how we're showing how race has been developing in our nation, right? And again, this idea of white supremacy, white superiority. What ends up happening is that we then have the erection of Confederate monuments, right? These Confederate monuments, you need to understand, they're not history. These are just sort of perpetuating a false narrative, right? So more than 700 monuments are found in 31 states. Only 11 of those are in the Confederacy. And the reality of these, it is to intimidate. It is to show African Americans stay in your place. It is to, for the people in the areas who have to look at these, again, to really push this idea that of white superiority, and really to hold people back in their place. Now, these monuments are put in public spaces. So you'll find them in parks, you'll find them in front of courthouses. So again, very public spaces. But the other thing is that there's no context to them. So you can't really understand, right? So when you're viewing, a big statue of one of the Confederate generals, it's really memorializing them, and it's honoring them, which you need to understand. And that's minimizing all of the atrocities that slavery was. It's minimizing what the real history, right? What the other thing that you need to understand is that these weren't created around the Civil War, right after the Civil War. The construction of these monuments, you see two spikes in when they're constructed. One is around the early 1900s, goes to the 1920s. Again, response to some of the progress that was attempted to be made for African Americans, right? The enactment of Jim Crow laws, this period. So going to push back into like some of the progress, and in addition to some of these other practices. You see another spike in the 1950s and 1960s. Again, so mid 1950s to 1960s. And again, this is a period where you have some progress for African Americans, or the fight for progress for African Americans. So it's going to be, again, this response to that. The first spike, the one in the early 1900s, is actually a larger spike that you see a lot of these going up in different places. But the second spike's a little smaller, but what's interesting to know is that in the smaller spike in the mid 20th century, it's not just monuments, it's not just statues that are going up, it's also memorializing these people in different ways. So in the naming of roads, the naming of streets, schools, which you need to think about that for African American kids who are entering these schools, what is that saying to them? What's the message being sent to them? And then also like military bases, right? So, and again, this is a response. So if mid 1950s, a response to a little partially to Brown versus Board of Education, the desegregation of schools, right? The other thing that you have to ask, because this is very relevant right now, the question of what are these monuments about? Should we remove them? There's a lot of people saying removing these monuments means we're erasing history. That is not the truth. This is not history. Again, especially with no context, this is not history. Who are the people who put these, who created them or who funded them? It's private groups that initially did it. One of the major ones is the United Daughters of the Confederacy, right? So it's private groups, meaning that the public, that these are in these public spaces, but the public had no opportunity to vote on these or to decide that these could be there. But it is now taxpayer money that's maintaining them and keeping them there. So there's some history to something very relevant to our time.
Mm-hmm. And also in that movement that you indicated here in the mid 1950s to late 1960s, I think it's also worthy to note that Georgia actually redesigned their state flag to resemble the Confederate flag more closely. And South Carolina started flying the Confederate flag over their own state capital during this same period of time. And so really think about, what does that symbolism mean? What are they trying to say?
Right. So we have this understanding now, I hope, of again the way that racism has been developed, was founded, has been developed in our nation. The thing is that then it becomes kind of difficult, right? Like to go back and sort of fix all of the things, the policies, the laws, everything that was put in place that's going to benefit whites and take opportunities and protection away from Black Americans, right? But the thing is that this stuff continues. So when we get into the 1930s and we get into the Great Depression, we're going to have the New Deal programs put into place, right? This, again, people are high unemployment rates, people are struggling, suffering. We have the New Deal programs that are supposed to help Americans. These programs, the agencies that are created under the New Deal, will deny a lot of these opportunities and benefits to African Americans. And it perpetuates the exclusion of African Americans. So you have for example, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. This is where they destroy sections of crops, right, to regulate the price. This does not benefit farmers and sharecroppers and tenant farmers, right? So these people who do not own land, it's not going to be very beneficial to them. The National Recovery Administration, for example, one of the things that they put into place is minimum wage. So protecting that in any employment, you must at least make a certain amount of money. That does not apply to field work, and it does not apply to domestic service work. You need to understand that those are two sections of employment that are predominantly, especially in some areas, predominantly held by African Americans. So where a lot of Americans are now going to be getting, these benefits, African Americans will not. And this is brand new in the 1930s, right? This is, we could have done better, and we don't. One of the big ones of the New Deal, Social Security, old age pensions are also denied to these two groups, who are mainly made up of Black workers. So think about what that means. Pushing for progress, sort of like uphill battle, where other Americans are able to take what is developed here. And you also need to know that a lot of the things that are created in the New Deal program are things that benefit Americans moving forward, right? They don't always just like disappear. So again, while others are getting opportunities to stabilize lives, to come out of the Depression, to later on we'll talk about housing and such, this is not afforded to African Americans.
But after the war, they did better, right? When they went overseas and they fought and they came home, they got
to get
you
to the
would
middle
think,
class.
you would hope.
For all Americans, right?
yeah, they came home and everything was good.
Thank you for your service.
So we have the GI Bill, and what's interesting is when the GI Bill passes in Congress, it was the Southern congressmen that demanded that the states administer the program, because then they could monitor then who got the benefits, right?
Can you talk
And
about
so,
what the GI Bill was, Beth, just for those in our audience who don't know what the GI Bill was?
So the GI Bill was for the veterans who were coming home, who had fought during World War II, and they came home, and it guaranteed a home loan. It gave them money for college or for vocational training, and it really was the ticket to middle class, right? The United States has always sort of boasted that we created the middle class, and we did it immediately after World War II. And this is primarily how it's done, right? How do you get to middle class? How do you get that house with a white picket fence and 2.5 children, right? You get educated and you get property. And what we see with the GI Bill, what had happened for Black American veterans who came home is, one, they were, all those fabulous new suburban homes that got built, they were not allowed to buy in those new housing tracts. Many banks refused to even give them home loans. Even if they found a house that they could buy, they were probably paying over market value for it and probably paying higher than this guaranteed loan. And we put a statistic here that it's not just the South that's not giving Black veterans their loans, but look at New York and New Jersey, right? Only 100 out of 67,000 of the VA loans actually went to Black veterans. We also find that when these Black veterans want to go to school at Northern universities, they often drive to their feet, or they try to reroute them to other colleges that were uncredited, meaning that the units don't really count, or they routed them to vocational schools. But once you got to a vocational school, even there, your opportunities were limited because the fields that actually paid money, like electrical, plumbing, and printing, they reserved those courses for the white veterans. So they're completely blocked from joining this middle class. Like the easiest way it was for white Americans to do it, they're not allowed to.
So we see African Americans denied the benefits of arguably the two biggest social benefits programs in American history. And that's a symbolic pushing away into Blacks as second-class citizens. So as we round into now near the close of our presentation, let's now look at when African Americans were fed up. They said, oh, look, if you're not going to give us these benefits, we're going to struggle and protest for them. As you might imagine, as we've been discussing for the last hour or so, whites did not take too kindly to this. Now, the Brown v. Board of Education decision, the Supreme Court decision in the 1950s, that's a nice place to start. What that decision did is it integrated schools. It says that the separate but equal clause that African Americans can attend one school and whites can attend another school is unconstitutional. It promised that Blacks and whites would come together, and it immediately inflames this violent rejection of it. Down south, these things called white citizens councils, they're kind of pseudo KKK. 500,000 white Southerners join it. 100 members of Congress signed something called the Southern Manifesto, which calls the Brown decision a clear abuse of judicial power. It actually encourages local citizens to resist the law. And on the right, we see a newspaper, a white supremacist newspaper, saying school integration is racial suicide. Beth, do you have the text for that along the bottom?
Yeah, at the very bottom, we were laughing that we think this is such a beautiful picture, right, of all these school children. And then I read the very bottom and it says, above is an example of what the race mixers want to happen in every school in America. Notice that every shade of color is represented in the picture, from coal black to high yellow, as well as pure white. What will America's answer be? Segregation and racial purity, or integration and mongrelization?
Oh my God.
We must give our answer now.
Yeah. So when, as African Americans are demanding more rights, whites oppose it. And, a way to discuss this is really just public polling. Gallup did a series of polls in the 1960s. In 1961, 84% of Americans thought early civil rights actions actually weren't helping, which is kind of amazing to think that. I don't know how else they were going to get integrated. It wasn't like whites were like, hey, dude, come on into our store.
And these were peaceful protests.
Right, exactly. Peaceful protests. 1963, we see 74% think it's actually hurting the movement. Because again, it's the uppity black challenging whites about their superiority. In 1966, Martin Luther King Jr., who was held up for good reason as this epitome of nonviolent protest and really this moral authority, 63% of Americans had a negative view of Martin Luther King Jr. a couple years before he died. Now, just by way of comparison, George Wallace, who was the arch segregationist governor of Alabama, who really came to national fame by resisting the integration of the University of Alabama, he was the 8th most admired American. So this is something to keep in mind when we really despair about what's going on now and say, how could we get this bad? Look, it's been like, this is our country. Now, the Black Panther Party is a fascinating case study for what happens when a group of African Americans demand rights. They're usually pilloried as a bunch of angry black men carrying guns. And because that perfectly fits into that stereotype of African Americans we've been spelling out. But that completely violates the actual historical reality of the Black Panther Party. They had 3 major goals that they've widely publicized. One is to provide leadership for their country. The Black Panther Party argued, whites have betrayed us, so we need to sort of support ourselves. They wanted to provide education for the community, to sort of strengthen their own communities for themselves, for black people, by black people. And finally, what they were most known in their communities, like Oakland, California, was providing food and healthcare for the community because the system wasn't working for them. On the right is a picture of a black man giving free breakfast to these lower income African-American kids. Now, J. Edgar Hoover declared the Black Panther Party the gravest threat to the United States. For good reason, because we don't want to give poor black kids breakfast. Really, the reason why the Black Panthers were so scary is because they argued rather persuasively that African Americans were equal, that they deserve equality, and that if the state was not going to give it to them, they were going to do it themselves because they're capable of it themselves. Black power challenged the tenets of white supremacy we've been spelling out. Hoover, the FBI, and a large segment of the United States went down for that. COINTELPRO, which was a counterintelligence operation, the Black Panthers immediately are disrupted by this FBI sting operation. FBI agents infiltrate, they break up the Panthers, and really the Black Panther Party sort of falls apart because of fear, persecution, murder. There's a well-publicized case of 2 Black Panthers being murdered in their sleep in Chicago. For really no other good reason other than they were Black Panthers.
And then Maite, earlier you were talking about the image of Black Panthers carrying guns.
Yeah, so that's really important because that is, Kevin spelled out what the Black Panther Party was about. It's about making progress for the African-American communities, right? But there were those images of them holding guns in front of the Capitol building with their leather jackets, right? Looking awesome. We got to admit, they look awesome. But they use those images, the media and other people use those images to say, look, see, we told you black men are violent, look what happens. The reason, this question of violence, I hope that you're sort of like thinking about that, how the direction that violence has always gone in this country, right? When we're talking about race. The reason why they were holding guns is because, or why they started to do that in the first place, was because at that time, first of all, it was legal in California to hold exposed weapons. but they were doing that to patrol their neighborhoods. Police were exercising extreme amount of brutality against Black young boys and Black men. And so what they started doing is that they would, whenever somebody was being pulled over in their community, they would just stand there with their guns and just observe. That's what they were doing. They were observing to ensure the safety of the people in their communities so that the police would not abuse their powers physically, right? And again, so they were sort of protecting against violence. They were protecting against violence, but then those images were shown to just demonstrate, look, they are violent. Be afraid. We told you need to be afraid of these men, right? When again, as Kevin was pointed, what really like laid out very nicely, look at all the other wonderful things that the Black Panthers were actually doing, right?
So that's I'm sorry, Beth, go ahead.
Yeah, and this harkens back to when Maite was going over the laws of colonial America, 1631, right? Why don't we let the Africans that are in the colonies have guns, right? And maybe we should say that they were giving guns to the English colonists to protect themselves against the Indians, but we're not going to give guns to the Africans. And that's carried through for 400 years, that we don't, we're very afraid, right, of Black men that have guns.
Right. And then since you brought that up, I just want to add too, that when we're talking about giving guns and like, being able to protect your property, it wasn't really to protect against, Native, although there were conflicts, it was because they wanted to use their guns to kill natives to take their land.
Well, right.
Right.
So again, where it has the violence.
So, well, just quickly, this topic about, surveying Black bodies, oppressing them, this really happens. This is the story of the late 20th century. For reasons we've already described, this country grows increasingly segregated. The practice of redlining, that's the practice of denying minority individuals a loan to buy a house. That the denial of those loans means that African Americans become larger communities of renters rather than owners. Meanwhile, where a lot of those homes are being built after World War II in those suburbs, they come attached with restrictive covenants that actually said, if you are Black, you cannot buy in these communities. This is all happening amidst larger historical trends that you see white flights from city. White families are moving out of cities, attracted by these low-cost homes and favorable infrastructural policies. The government is building all these schools and roads out in the suburbs. Meanwhile, those cities are starting to decay. Within those cities, less and less money is going into urban infrastructure, schools for these largely minority communities. And in large part, it's because suburban families, they don't like seeing their tax dollars going to support African Americans. Again, this has been a theme we've been talking about, but it isn't like there's no money going into cities. They're actually going into police departments. Those police departments begin becoming militarized so that police departments have better powers of surveying people. One thing to note as we're talking about the police departments, what we want to note is that there is this culture of surveillance that cannot be ignored. And I think that it's difficult to say, when we say defund the police, it's not that we want to get rid of police. I'm saying I'm sort of betraying my bias, but we're not, the argument is not that there should be no police departments. It's that, why don't we spend a little bit less money on police departments and helping out African-American communities in ways that this country has failed them for 400 years. Mm-hmm. Now, Nixon becomes the godfather of this playing upon white anxiety. He's the candidate of law and order, as you see there. Law and order is dog whistle racism as you see all these rebellions and riots that are happening, as you see more and more civil rights protests, he's the man to restore order and the racial status quo. And he's the candidate of the silent majority, an implicitly white group of people who do not like all of these protesters who are threatening to disrupt, one could say, what makes America great. So I think this is it, Beth.
Yeah, we're just gonna jump real quick to Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. 1976, he gives a speech where he talks about this woman who was driving a Cadillac and had built to the government out of thousands of dollars. And he was actually telling the truth. There was a woman, her name was Linda Taylor. She had 33 different aliases. She was the perfect con artist. She did drive a Cadillac. She had conned the government out of a lot of money. No one was really sure what her race was, though. Someone did find in 1930 on the census she had marked herself as white. but she had gone by being Jewish, she had gone by being Asian. So anyway, Reagan talks about this woman as he's talking about the government's need to reduce dependency. And this idea of a welfare queen then gets attached to Black women. And when we think about why is this attached to Black women, what is it saying? And I want you to think back to that freedom, you know, the
Democratic Party of Pennsylvania, 1866.
Yeah, of that image of the Black man sort of lounging about, being lazy while the whites worked really hard, and he got to reap the benefits of their hard work. So here's that image, it comes back again, right, in the late 1970s and the 1980s. And in addition to this, if we think about a Black woman who is mooching off of the federal government, why does she need to mooch off of the federal government? Does she have children? Probably so. Does she have a husband? You know, the insinuation is that there's an absent father. And so again, it's not just denigrating the African-American woman, it's also denigrating, right, the Black males.
So let's sum this up.
So we've got 400 years, we've just gone through 400 years of a narrative for you that talks about Black Americans as being inferior, lazy, and at times dangerous.
Now, after the Civil War, when African Americans were freed, when they tried to move beyond this narrative, try to obtain businesses and education, white Americans responded with riots, massacres, and killings, because racism says just as much about what whites think about themselves as African Americans. Now, after World War II, African Americans are denied fundamental government programs that would have presented social mobility to the middle class. You know, also when African Americans try to avail themselves of those social programs, they're shamed as lazy in terms that actually wouldn't be completely out of place among Enlightenment philosophers in the 1700s.
So the construct of white supremacy narrative not only affects the Black community, but also affects all communities of color. This is really important. I'm very fortunate to work with the people I work with. Again, ASGCC, Student Equity, and Social Sciences Division. We put this lecture on because of what's going on in our country at this very moment. And we need to keep the focus and we need to keep the momentum going. We need to keep the focus on African Americans. And again, you see that we have deep history here, that this is not something that happened recently. It's not a 21st century problem. This is a long-standing problem. But you also need to understand that this creation of whiteness is also, and then the creation of the other affects everybody. It affects all communities of color, and it actually does affect and impact every single one of us. So we all need to care. You shouldn't care only when it impacts you. You should care all the time. But that we hope that you understand, again, what this country, what our real history looks like.
So I believe now we've 21 minutes for questions.
Hi, everyone. I'm here. I have 7 questions for you, and I don't know if we'll be able to ask all 7 of them. So let's start with one from George Castillo. George, thank you for your question. Were there free African in the colonies prior to 1619?
In the colonies?
Right, yes.
Not in the English, are you talking about the English colonies in the New World? in the...
He didn't clarify. George, do you have are you talking about the English colonies in the Americas? I would assume so.
Yeah.
So talking about
go ahead, Maite.
Well, in the English colonies, like with the Jamestown, I would say not in the colonies, but I mean there were by that point like different people, different populations in the Americas, and right, yeah.
And in other colonies of the Americas, there are Africans there. Like in the Spanish colonies,
yeah,
there's a lot that are both free and slave. But in the English colonies, to my knowledge, there aren't really many that to be.
Yeah, the first slaves arrived 1619, and as soon as they hit our shores, the captain of that Dutch man of war, he trades them for goods. He trades them for food. So they immediately become labor. But after, we're not sure exactly how many years, it was probably 5 to 7, the same as for an indentured servant, we see, like in the case of Anthony and Mary, they are able to obtain their own freedom, right? They can purchase their own freedom back, and they can convert to Christianity, which creates free Africans in the English colonies in the early years.
Thank you. And actually, George added a clarification to his question. I guess it pertains to indentured servitude. So George, if I'm understanding your question, if there were free Africans that were themselves indentured servants, is that your question then?
So students often get confused.
He's saying yes.
Indentured servants were white.
Mm-hmm.
We really need to make that clear. Indentured servants were always white. They were from England. And then you have the Africans that arrive.
The deal was that, you know, if you're a poor white living in London, you can't afford the trip. So you get somebody over in America to pay your ship ticket, pay for your ticket, and then you pay off that ticket by working. Because there weren't many Africans living in England at that time, you know, that way of doing things was off limits to them. But there were, I mean, because as we said, the notion of modern slavery hadn't been constructed early at that time, there are African Americans who were practically, you know, servants. The notion of slavery is kind of a fungible term that's created over time.
Right, thank you. And George said that answered his question. Thank you, George. Let's see, a second question from George. I'm asking these questions sequentially for fairness. Is there a similarity between the photos of slave owners that you showed earlier, attempting to sugarcoat slavery by being photographed with their slaves, and the photos of police officers kneeling with the protesters?
Oh my gosh, it's so interesting, especially because I just saw today that the New York police who had kneeled with the protesters apologized to the police force and said that they shouldn't have done it. So it's very interesting, right? So Maite, you were talking about the images of like the families with their servants and the photographs that they would take.
Yeah, I'm trying to think about that because, yeah, so initially those first images, that's what they were about. They were sort of a couple of things, right? Well, first of all, like with the photographs after 1850, like just like us now, when there's new technology, you're like, that's how you show off you have money or you can access this new technology, right? So you take pictures of, you bring a photographer in, take the family portraits and so forth. And then again, these families who own slaves, it's this way of saying, first, look that I'm wealthy enough to own slaves. And the other thing, this idea of, let me show you also that they're almost like part of our family. We treat them so well, right? So it's that. So now in thinking about it with the police, I'm trying to think of what that means because there's not, like, I wouldn't say, unless I'm wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, I wouldn't say that there was sort of like a history to that where the police are sort of like taking images and saying, look at what we're doing with you know, like I'm not sure. And then going off and doing like, this is a response, you know, them kneeling and so forth is a response to maybe them trying to make things, calm things down, show a different side of them. I mean, not that I'm saying that it's correct or not, but showing a different side of them sort of being with the public and the demonstrators. So I personally would say that it's like the same, although there is something there.
Yeah, like I said, I would hope it's not for show, but again, that article that just came out today where he's apologizing for being on the side of the protesters makes you wonder, was it a show?
I mean, it shows, no play on words, but the problem that these protesters are going up against is that they're butting up against this 400-year pile of white supremacy. Mm-hmm. Just add on to that. Hopefully we answer your question, George.
Great, thank you. Next one is from Mike July. Can you address racism against other groups as well, Asians, Latinos, etc.?
Well, I can say a little bit on that. That's sort of like what we wrapped it on. And like, we really wanted to focus on racism, you know, the racism against African Americans in our country. But we really create, like in our country, like it's real specific to our country, right? Like we create this binary. Yes, similar things happen in other places, but we create this binary early on, you know, black and white. And then from that point forward, you're going to then use that template to other, you know, immigrants, Asian people coming from Asia, people coming from Eastern Europe, Southern Italy, right? So there is something there that, again, the creation of this idea of race as it develops here will be impacting all types of other groups, right? Then it's easy sort of to like use this template. Like one thing that happens, for example, with school segregation. Did I freeze again?
We hear you.
No, you're good.
We can
Okay.
hear you. Yeah.
One thing that happens with like school segregation is like for I think it's like in Texas when we're talking about Mexican and Mexican American kids coming into schools, then the question is like, well, you can't come here, right? Like you're not a white kid. Yeah, well, they're not black. Yeah, but you're not white. And sort of it becomes very murky, right? One of the things that happens too, this is why those like miscegenation laws, why they early on, we don't want the races mixing, is because then it gets too blurry. It becomes too blurry, right? So I don't know if Kevin and Beth want to add to that, but it's
Yeah, I mean, from the perspective,
everyone who's not white.
Yeah, from the perspective of whiteness, I mean, there is a little bit of a distinction because of African Americans, just the unique history of slavery. But if you look at, say, you know, Maite brought up Mexican and Mexican American community, we see a lot of similar things in Southern California, that Mexicans coming into this country, working, demanding rights. It's an affront to whiteness. And we see also a lot of the similar ways to put sort of Latinx groups in their place. If you know about like World War II and something called the Zoot Suit Riots, it's another white mob violence directed against a community of color. What the Zoot Suit Riots was World War II. You have Chicano and you have Filipino teenagers who would wear these suits called zoot suits. And, you know, in one way they were sort of a form of like racial pride. It's like, yeah, this is our culture, like this sort of uniform. But to whites, it represented like, oh my God, these people, they're taking over our town. So for a couple days in LA, riots broke out where whites, you know, sailors off of a base in Long Beach came and just beat the hell out of all these kids. It's a similar pattern to what we see when whites regard a quote unquote uppity non-white group, they need to reassure themselves of their whiteness. In the case of the Zoot Suit Riots, even in the course of World War II, when you're facing an existential crisis to your country.
Yeah, and again, sort of focusing on this idea of white supremacy, it's not just Black Americans, it's not just Mexican Americans. You know, we can go all the way back to 1880s, right, for the Chinese Exclusion Act, right, with those immigrants that are coming into California and how we're, you know, riots against them. And, you know, in downtown LA, we hung up Chinese immigrants, you know, the same way we lynched African Americans in the South. So we're so nervous about whiteness that when all of these European immigrants start arriving, we actually constructed levels of whiteness because those European immigrants, well, they're not white like me, but they look kind of white. So we constructed levels of whiteness as to where they all fit.
Yeah, I mean, what I tell my students just is this is kind of wedded into the United States history, that like there's two sort of different visions of the United States that are always in conflict. Is America a country of white people? Is it a race? Or is America a country of ideas? Is America because it's not really like who are Americans? We're a country of immigrants. We're wedded to these ideas represented by the Declaration of Independence and sort of solidified in the Constitution. Or are we a country of white people? And I think that is always in conflict. And I think that I'd like to think that fight hasn't gone on, but I think it's upon us as Americans to keep going to the voting booth and decide what vision of America do we stand for. I mean, I think to put it in that sort of stark terms is not completely inaccurate.
Sadly, I think we can also go into any of these groups and really show a history on any of the groups, right? Mm-hmm. On how they've been treated in our country. Japanese internment camps during World War II. Like you can go on and on, sadly, you know.
Good question, Mike Dulai.
Hazel, you're on mute.
Oh, sorry about that. Yes. This one is from Hans Petros. Let's see. He said, people outside and inside of United States claim if the US system was racist, it wouldn't let Michael Jordan to be a successful millionaire or people like Oprah get that high status and rich, or they wouldn't have a black president and many other successful black icons. How, oh, sorry, my eyes, I can't read. How can we respond to this claim since it is controversial and manipulative? It's an interesting question.
That is a really good question. It's something we often see. I've heard that argument made as well. I think for one thing, we can make the argument that usually, I think in the case of Michael Jordan, didn't inflame white supremacists the same way that Barack did, because Michael Jordan succeeded in a job that is fitted for Black Americans. That we can use Black Americans' labor on basketball courts, on the football field, and we can use that. It's not still suppressing it's not threatening our superiority. So I would say one thing that I think there's a big gulf between Michael Jordan selling Air Jordans and Barack Obama controlling the military. So that's one thing. The second thing I would say is that there's a difference between exceptions and sort of like just patterns. So that in the wake of like these riots we've been talking about that have been in Memphis or they've been in New Orleans or Wilmington, it isn't just that there's one. I think white supremacists can see that and talk themselves, and it's okay. That it's okay that Tiger Woods is making hundreds of millions of dollars at golf. It's still not really threatening my place in the racial hierarchy. But when you start having sort of these patterns here of like, well, there's a critical mass, then it can be sort of dangerous. And I think that if it was an entire Congress of Barack Obamas, then it would be really, really threatening. I think white supremacy can stomach one or two successes, and hopefully it won't be a pattern. That's my early answer to that.
Absolutely. Can I add something to that? Also, like when you're talking, like because the question specifically addresses Michael Jordan, like you have Michael Jordan, who again is an exceptional player, right? He's an exceptional person. But out of him, consider how many Michael Jordans we have. Also think about the labor of Black men, as Kevin was saying. How many white men are behind the scenes making a ton of money off of their labor, compared to like you have a few Michael Jordans, and then compared to like how much money the rest of the players are making. That's not going to be really, you can't really compare it, right? So it's again, I wouldn't say that they're like letting them succeed for the sake of uplifting African Americans. They're letting them succeed so that they can make their own money.
Yeah, and I would just add also real quick, just because you have one or two examples of successes, it's not representative of what's happening to the entire community, right? I used to really struggle when I was trying to teach how African-American women make like the lowest wage, right? When you're looking at white men, and then white women were sort of equal with Black men, and then Black women were even lower. Yet what woman was making the most money in the United States at the time but Oprah Winfrey? Like how, so it's difficult to deal with this, but these single individuals, yeah, good for them, but what about the rest of the community?
It's a question
that's where it's harmful. And if somebody wants to bring up Barack Obama, yeah, they deny that he had the right to be president, right? He wasn't born here, right? The whole birth certificate argument that followed him, for 8 years, and who led that argument but our current president.
Can I say too that these kind of ideas are also dangerous when they seep into communities of color, because then for those who succeed and are able to get out of their communities, this idea of like, well, I got out, what's wrong with you, right? Like that's also very dangerous because it's institutionalized. Again, it's not any individual person. That's again, going into the history, we see how it is in everything that America is built on, really.
Great. All right, our next question is from Alexandra Evans. Thank you. White supremacy has been mentioned throughout the presentation, but has not been verbally refuted. Do the instructors believe that there is truth in the idea of white superiority?
No.
We
No,
believe in white superiority. Absolutely not.
no, everyone's equal.
On the record, absolutely not.
Yeah, no, yeah, no, everyone's equal.
Is there a follow-up question to that, or?
Well, I think it is useful though, because we did cite these philosophers, and maybe like what I think one thing we can do with, for the students out there is realize so much of what you read and that what are alleged authority figures, it's kind of BS. What is the corpus of academia was created by a bunch of white men that often is self-serving to show that how smart white men are. So I guess this sort of answers her question. Like I think a corollary to this is that like part of like white supremacy, we obviously refute it, but like I think part of what we see is that like as a white person myself, I never really have to engage in questions of race, and I never really have to forcibly refute it because I'm so used to it. I think that, and your question is really useful, and that reveals how I am a beneficiary of white supremacy, that I never really have to deal with issues of race that my colleagues who are African American or Latinx or whatever, they have to deal with on a daily basis. So like, while, obviously I refute white supremacy, I think that, I think that question points to the idea that I don't engage with it enough, or I don't forcibly refute it enough.
Can I say something? This is like such an important, wonderful question. Like the other thing is that like in our history, we're struggling, right? Like our history had been written again by white men, right? So like we had been told, we had been denied everything that we were trying to do today. It's like, look at all the evidence of these things. But in doing that, like we also, then the next steps is also along with everything that had happened, look at all the, everything that African Americans, like if we're focusing on African Americans, everything that they've contributed to our country, everything that they've done, everything they've created, music, art, and then ripped off, right? They like music, art, everything has been also like then ripped off by whites. That we have to, that's part of our role as historians also, right? That we need to then go off and first of all, be very clear about the tragic history of racism in our country, and then also include all of the wonderful things that, and then, not just for African Americans, but for women, right? Women, Latinx, the gay community, you can go on and on, right? With everything else that other groups have done that has just been omitted in history. And it's really, if you're thinking of the history in the country, it's really recent that we're starting to dig these things up, right?
Thank you. Alexandra had a thought that she wanted to add, that you cannot assume, right? That no one has said that it is untrue. It just has to be said.
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah. It's that acknowledgement. So we're nearing the end of our session. So we have 2 questions left, but we only have time for one more. Kayla, is that okay? That we ask one more? And the last, the other one, we can post it onto our list of questions. And on Friday of next week, we will have an open forum that we will incorporate that. So Noah, is that okay? Great. So the last question is from Chris Karpatyan. Were there the same problem in Canada with African Canadians as in the United States in the 20th century?
Oh, that's such a good one.
This is beyond my realm.
I'm not as familiar with some of these details with Canada. Sorry.
Right.
I mean, I know that. Sorry, go ahead, Beth.
No, go ahead. I have to think. Go ahead.
Like, so on one hand, African Americans were able to create communities in Canada, especially during the 19th century, that they were unable to do in the United States. That oftentimes the Underground Railroad did not end in the U.S. because if you got off the Underground Railroad, not got off, you didn't like jump off the train, but if you ended up in Indiana, you were going back home. You had to continue into Canada. So in some ways, Canada offered a refuge, but in terms of how they were treated in the 20th century. Beth, you were going to say something.
Yeah, so, you know, remember that at this period of time, Canada is still part of England. And, you know, when we fought in the American Revolution and then also in the War of 1812, right, that the British had said to the slaves, if you fight with us, we will free you. But, you know, Great Britain doesn't win. So a lot of those former slaves can escape into Canada and they actually get taken care of, right? The government in Canada lets them come in and they do live freer lives. We have a letter of a slave who escaped to Canada, and he actually writes a letter back to his old slave master, like, my life is so much better here. And you know, and he writes it himself. So he's educated, you know, he's got a house. It's, Canada's going to have their own issues with their native populations, which they're still dealing with today. But yeah, I would say for the African Americans that were in colonial America and even post-colonial America, if you could escape to Canada, you were definitely free.
And the reason, I'll quickly wrap this up. Like a big reason why too that it was a different deal in Canada is that, you know, slavery doesn't exist there, and there isn't large-scale plantation agriculture in Canada. Mm-hmm. It's tough to grow cotton outside Montreal. So, you know, I think part of this too is that you have this linkage of racism and capitalism in the United States, which encodes a lot of meanings on Black bodies in the United States you don't see in Canada. Mm-hmm. It's not that Canada is the land of milk and honey. It's that, however, it had a unique history that is different than the United States' tight connection between racism and capitalism. That means that, you know, Canadians, their understandings of race are a little bit different. Of course, we obviously got to say it's not like there's no racism at all. And Anglophone countries, Britain struggles with racism a lot, and with post-colonial countries immigrating there. But that's for another conversation for another day.
We were one of the last countries to make slavery illegal, though, across the world.
All right, so first of all, I just want to say one thing. Thank you guys so much. About this last question, I just wanted to mention, though I have not nearly as many qualifications as all of you, obviously, I am. And I was born and raised until 2 years ago, in Canada, and we read a number of novels of how slaves escaped the United States and made their way to Canada. So it's a very, very relevant topic. That's all I want to say. I don't want to say too much because I don't have nearly as much information.
No. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. So anyways, thank you so much for engaging with us tonight. And thank you to our presenters and moderators, Professor Kronbeck, Professor Mack, and Professor Peterson. I can safely say that the presentation was very, very effective in communicating the history of institutionalized racism. And it was also very informative, just to hear your, what you guys have to say about the many questions that the audience had. So if the audience still has questions that were not addressed tonight, we will be sending a link to an evaluation form where you guys can leave your questions and any additional feedback for tonight's lecture. And we will also be addressing any additional questions at our closing forum next Friday, which was mentioned not too long ago. Next Friday, June 19th, from 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. So please join us for the rest of our lecture series on this same link and at the same time. The next one will be on Monday, same time, same link. More information can be found on glendale.edu/antiracism. For GCC students, if you need a safe space to discuss and process.
Sorry. Where can you find more information?
Oh yeah, glendale.edu/antiracism. Mm-hmm. You got it. So so for GCC students, if any of you guys need a safe space to discuss and process these heavy topics, we will be hosting healing circles after each lecture led by Dr. Troy Davis and our student equity counselors. please join us on a separate link that will be sent in the chat. It's already been sent a couple of times. And we will be ending this meeting now to start that healing circle. So thank you so much again for joining us, and have a great rest of your evening.